and spell your last name and give me your title.
Joanne Perilli, P-A-R-R-I-L-L-I, Associate Justice, Division 3.
Great.
And Wes Walker, retired Associate Justice, Court of Appeal.
All right, Justice Perilli, we are all ready to go. And if you want to give maybe just a sentence introduction as to why we're here.
This interview is being conducted as part of the Appellate Court Legacy Project. The purpose of the project is to preserve an oral history of the appellate courts in California through a series of interviews of the justices who have served on our court. We are pleased to have with us this morning the Honorable Herbert Wes Walker, who served on the 1st District from May of 1996 through March 2001. Wes, you're a native Californian. Tell us a little bit about your childhood, especially what it was like to have a father who was a judge, and how that might have influenced your decision to study law and ultimately to seek a judicial appointment.
Okay, I grew up in Glendale, California. Actually, as a child, Dad worked early on as with the Division of Corporations doing corporate law. He went on to be Chief Deputy District Attorney in Los Angeles County under Fred Hauser in the mid to late 40s, and then went on the bench in early 1950, appointed by Earl Warren at the time. So I was really grown by the time he went on the bench, but of course was very familiar with his work prior to the time that I took off for college.
Did you attend high school in Glendale then?
Went to high school in Glendale High School.
When you were in grade school or high school, did you ever think you would end up as a lawyer?
You know, I didn't. In fact, I probably did not want to be a lawyer because I saw how hard my father was working most of his work life. When I got to Stanford, I was majored in geology for about 3.5 years. And the career opportunities in the early 50s, or the mid-50s when I graduated, were primarily with oil companies going to Saudi Arabia looking for oil, which didn't appeal to me too much. So at that point in time, I convinced myself the law would be a good career.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
2 sisters,
And
one younger, one older.
are they still in California? Or?
My older sister is deceased. My younger sister lives here in San Francisco.
Did either of them consider law as a career, if you know?
I don't think so. Both of them, this is back in the days when people got married and had children, had families, and then took care of their families. My younger sister, Elizabeth, lived in Los Banos for years. Her husband, they had a farm. They had in the farm implement business in Los Banos, and then she raised a whole bunch of kids, so that was her life.
And how many generations of native Californians had there been in the Walker lineage by the time you arrived?
Oh boy. My grandmother was born here in San Francisco in the 1860s. I'm not sure the exact date. My father was born in San Francisco in 1898 or 1899, I think. My mother was born in Los Angeles in early 1900s, so that would be, what, 3 generations?
Wonderful. And you've already told us you graduated, or you attended Stanford. When was it that you graduated?
1955.
And did you go directly into law school?
Went directly to USC to go to law school, yeah.
And what was USC like back then in the 50s?
You know, I've sort of been torn over this issue all of my adult life. I, at the time, really wanted to stay at Stanford to go to law school. Well, my father, my mother, and my 2 sisters all graduated from USC, and Dad convinced me that it was really imperative that I go to USC, what is now Law Center. At that time, in the late 50s, probably 2/3 of the lawyers in Los Angeles were SC grads. UCLA really didn't get started until early, mid-50s. And a good portion of the judges there were USC grads, so he thought that was important. So
Was it pretty much an all-male environment back then?
pretty much we had 3 or 4 women in the class. Out of, I think the entering class was around 140. We ended up with about 80-something. And there were probably 2 or 3 women that graduated.
How about minorities? Any minorities back then?
A few, not a lot.
And most of the graduates in your class, did you ever keep track of how their careers went or where they ended up?
You know, a little bit. Of course, we had reunions periodically, the last one being our 50th here several years ago. Surprisingly, most of them stayed in the Los Angeles area. Most of them were very successful in larger law firms down there, and pretty much stayed close to home.
And then after law school, what was your first venture as a practitioner?
Oh boy, when I was actually in law school, I worked for the LA County Council. Gophering in the afternoon after classes, I'd go down and pick up papers and run them down to the presiding judge, who at that time was Stanley Mosk. And this was back in 1956, 57. So after graduation, I stayed with the county council as a deputy for not quite a year. At that point, wanted to get out of the big city, and frankly wanted to get out of my father's shadow, which was fairly large in Los Angeles at that point. So
Was he on the bench by then?
he was on the bench by then, and ended up trying most of the high-profile criminal cases in Los Angeles County, including the Sirhan case later on in the 60s. So in any event, I had a classmate that was with a firm in Santa Ana, and I, after about a year at the county council, hooked up with them and stayed there over 20 years.
Any noticeable changes from the legal environment in LA County moving to Orange County?
Totally different. You know, you go from the big city to basically a cow county.
Back then?
Back then. Well, back then it was all bean fields and orange groves. You know, there was some merger of the population in Buena Park and Garden Grove, the northern part of the county, but the rest of the county was still agricultural and fairly rural.
And the firm that you worked with?
Rutan and Tucker, which went from, I think I was the 9th attorney with the firm when I left in the late 70s. There were close to 90, and now there's, I think, 150, so it's grown substantially.
What kind of a practice did you have there?
Initially, I was doing insurance defense work. I was doing misdemeanor prosecutions for 2 of the cities. I was city prosecutor for what was then Cypress and Dairyland, 2 cities on the western side of the county. There were still dairy farmers and hadn't really been developed at that point. So I did insurance defense, city prosecutorial work, worked from that into really complex civil litigation over the years.
And you eventually became managing partner there.
Managing partner for several years in the mid-70s, right.
And was that before billable hours, or was that?
That was at a time when at least in the firm I was in, I think all firms very typically, where you still had to maintain your billable hours and do the administrative work. So I was putting in, I guess in the mid-70s, somewhere around 2,500 to 2,600 hours a year, including perhaps 1,800 billables at that time. So
And
that was one of the reasons I think I burnt out and decided to go to Napa.
And after Rutan and Tucker, and those years in Southern California, what was your next job in the legal world?
Actually, I moved out in a solo practice and was associated with 2 or 3 other attorneys for about a year. 2 of my ex-partners at Rutan and Tucker had moved to Napa in the early 70s. So they came after me to rejoin them, which I did.
And when did you make the move then from Southern California up to the north?
Actually, we bought property in 1979 and moved up there in early 1980.
And what was that like? You've gone from big city Southern California to the countryside back then, and then to the wilderness, I guess, by...
Well, the countryside, the countryside had grown. I mean, by the time I left in the early 80s, it was big city.
What was Napa like when you first got there?
Napa was a very small town. I still had a number of clients in the Southern California area, and for the first year or 2 did a lot of commuting and maintained that client base down there. But Napa was a small town. You know, there were 3 Superior Court judges and 3 municipal court judges. The firm I joined there, or rejoined, 2 of my partners, there were, I think, 8 or 9 of us at that time.
And how long were you with that firm before you went
About
to
5 years before I was appointed.
And during the time that you were practicing law there, what was your practice pretty much a civil?
Pretty much same thing, civil litigation. The complexity of it changed dramatically. I was hanging on to a lot of the statewide practice for a while, and I got tired of traveling, and it became more of a small town civil practice, although we had a lot of very good clients there in the winery business, vineyards, the industry in Napa Valley.
And that became a personal interest of yours at some point, that growing of grapes, didn't it?
We planted a small vineyard in 1990, actually.
What made you decide to put your name in for a judgeship, Wes?
I think a number of reasons. I think the fact that I had always admired my father and felt that he really had done a great job at being a judge. I found it to be, at that point in my career, something I felt would be more rewarding than the constant battle in court, which I think is proven out pretty much.
You were directly appointed to the Superior Court by Governor Duke Machen in
Correct.
1985. What were your first trial assignments? Did they put you right into civil, having had all that wealth of experience?
Typically in small counties, I did go right into trial work, into civil trial work. But in small counties, you know, you do everything. You do criminal, you do domestic, you do family law, you do probate. Nobody's really specialized, but we were rotating on a yearly basis. My first assignment the first year was civil, which included family law, which I had very little background in at that point.
And I see that you were active in the delay reduction effort, which was coming into importance in all the trial courts about that time. What sparked your interest in trial delay reduction?
Oh boy. I think the principal reason was at that point in time, the court that I was with, Phil Champlin and Scott Snowden, really felt that we should be more active in administrative and management of the cases and management of the court. Up until that point in time, I think typically the courts were very much laid back and would allow the litigants to pursue their own timing, and you know, cases in the southern part of the state were taking 4 to 5 years or longer to get to trial. So we felt we had an opportunity in Napa County to set up the delay reduction process. And actually, other than Ventura and San Diego counties, I think we were the third to really adopt the delay reduction procedure, and we're very successful at it. We also, at the same time, were able to administratively consolidate both the municipal court and the Superior Court, which was unique. So we had both a consolidation and a delay reduction program that came in probably in the late 80s, 89, 88, 89, somewhere in that time frame. And
having practiced as a lawyer, did you experience the frustration when you were a lawyer of having your cases delayed beyond?
Obviously, and more you know, the frustration, but the feelings of the clients of just not being able to get to court, and particularly in the business area, which I was involved very heavily in, where you're dealing with contract law, you're dealing with real estate law. Problems need to be resolved timely, and they weren't being resolved timely. So we became very active in administering cases, and very successful. We were, in the first year, able to process over 90% between filing and disposal or disposition of them. So, and that ratio, I think, pretty well maintained itself to today. So.
And how did the relationship maintain between the lawyers practicing up there and the bench, which was a small bench, as you've said?
You mean as far as acceptance of the delay reduction?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was very good. I worked very closely. I set up a committee with a bar, local bar, and worked very closely with them in really adopting the rules and bringing them into the process, which I think worked very well.
Oh, it's so important.
And so when we got down to the point where we really cut into the delay reduction, they were, I think, many of them eager to get into it because of the time and because of the fact they could get cases tried and get them disposed of.
Sure, and they could share in the credit along with the court, which was...
And some very interesting results we had, at least in Napa, and I don't know if the rest of the state, but we found that after we instituted the delay reduction, we had about a 50% drop in civil filings. So all the junk filings that had been going on for years, with people filing and then sitting on them hoping to settle, disappeared. Wow. So our civil filings went way down, and we were able to obviously process cases a lot faster.
Any cases from your time on the Napa Superior Court that are particularly memorable, or any trials you had? Or?
Nothing really. You know, we did everything from murder to family law, and processed a lot of cases.
After more than 10 years then on the Napa Superior Court, you joined us in Division III in 1996 after Justice Merrill passed away. At the time, the division consisted of Justice Phelan, who had just been appointed presiding justice of the division in April of the same year, and Justice Corrigan and myself. Justice Chin had gone on to the Supreme Court on March 1st, the year that you joined us. Do you remember any first impressions you had of our division or the court here in the First District as a whole?
Oh boy. You know, it's a nice change. I enjoyed, I think, moving from the activity of the trial courts, which I thoroughly enjoyed and still thoroughly enjoy, into a more academic atmosphere. I think it was more creative. I felt more challenged, I think, mentally as far as applying the law and deciding cases. So it was a big change, as I'm sure you recall.
And we were still over at Marathon Plaza back then.
Still in the temporary court, yeah.
Yeah, so it was an easier commute at that stage, probably coming to, if you came down 80 in those days.
Actually, it wasn't bad then, because I could take the ferry down and from Vallejo and walk over to the court, which worked out real well.
How did the work compare with what you had done as a trial judge? Did you find it as interesting?
You mean as far as the quality?
Yeah.
As far as the quality of the cases, excuse me, I think it was very similar. You know, as you know, I mean, we have a mix, or had a mix, about 50-50 civil and criminal, and that was pretty much what we had on the Superior Court level, and the cases were pretty much identical. I don't think there were a few cases that obviously came out of the San Francisco and Oakland, Alameda County, which were larger cases, what we would have tried at Napa, which were more challenging, but pretty much the same overall.
Do you recall any cases that were your favorites or that kept you up late at night?
I guess the number kept me up late at night, but the several I found interesting. If you recall, the little ladies from Beardstown, which I think you were on the decision on. That was a fun case to try.
Tell us a little bit about that.
That was one where a group of little ladies in their 60s and 70s formed an investment group in Beardstown, Illinois. Became very famous because of the rate of return they were accomplishing in their investment club. Published a book which was very successful, and on the cover of the book they were indicating they were returning, I think, 24% investment return, and 3-to-1 what Standard & Poor's was doing. Well, turned out basically they were including a lot of things accounting-wise that really weren't normally included by investment bankers, including their annual dues, which were accumulated. So there was a suit brought for false advertising under Business Professions, I think 17,200 or 17,500, one of the two. The trial court, as I recall, either sustained the demurrer without leave or granted summary judgment. We reversed it and held that basically it wasn't violative of the First Amendment free speech because it was commercial speech. The cover of the book really was commercial. It was an advertisement. Even though it was in the content of the book itself, we held they did state a cause of action. So it was an interesting case.
Any others?
You know, another one that I think you were on was the Sousa versus Antioch case, the one where the child was killed by its father, and the mother brought a wrongful action, and we
Against the police department?
Against the police department. We found that there was a duty because of the control that was taken by the police department in Antioch. I thought it was a fascinating case, although it was cutting edge at that point, and as you recall, the publisher of opinions decided that we didn't want to perpetrate what we decided in the case. But it was an interesting case.
The great eraser in the sky.
Yeah, exactly.
Any others?
You know, the other one that I really got into, and then it was one that, in fact, the only case I was reversed by the Supreme Court, and I think you joined the reversal on that one, was the Norgaard versus Uptown case, the drug case. Question of whether or not the family of the decedent knew or should have known the dangers of the drugs she was taking that ultimately caused her to commit suicide. And we held that actually that the statute had not run, and the Supreme Court disagreed with us. But I found that to be a fascinating case, one that I still think we made the right decision on.
I remember one where I was a little worried, where Justice Corrigan and I were on opposite sides of an issue, and depending on who you agreed with, the majority would be formed. As I recall, discussions between Justice Corrigan and myself got a little heated from time to time on that case. Did we have you worried?
Not worried so much. I enjoyed watching the two of you work. and disagree, and I think both of you had excellent arguments. And again, it was a case that could have gone either way. I was convinced by Carol's logic that I should go with her. So,
Over the more than 40 years in the law that you served, did you observe any significant changes to the court system, positive or negative?
Yes, both. I think the courts, in a way, and I think my experience at Napa really went along with this, really became more aggressive as far as managing and administering the courts and administering their cases. We're not as laid back. I think the judges, at least when I was on the bench, were in my area, and I think in California, were very conscientious, very hardworking, did an excellent job. But I saw a shift from really in the 60s and 70s of the judges really not asserting themselves and controlling the course of litigation to a situation where, at least when I was on the bench, we were very careful to manage the cases, make sure that cases did get resolved timely. That's the plus side. On the negative side, I think judges today don't control their courts like they should. I think litigants and attorneys are getting away with a lot more than they should be getting away with. There's a lot of gamesmanship now that I don't think existed 20, 30, 40 years ago, which I think is unfortunate. I think it really impacts the ability of the trier of fact, whether it be a jury or a judge, to really resolve the case in a fair fashion.
Is there anything that you attribute that to?
A lot of it I attribute to the judges not really controlling the courtroom. I think that many of the younger judges that I see today want to make everybody happy, and you can't do that. And I think things get out of hand for the just lack of control. And I think the discovery process, you know, when I first started practicing law in the early 60s, discovery was brand new. And that's become a game in and of itself, which I think has generated a lot of the gamesmanship that now goes on in lawsuits. I think that's unfortunate. Discovery is necessary, but at the same time, I think it gets way out of control.
I know you've done many interesting things apart from the law, both while you were on our court and certainly after you left. And we're going to talk about those in just a few minutes. But since retiring, Wes, have you done any assigned judges work or private judging?
You know, I started out doing assigned judges, and I joined American Arbitration Association and was doing both assignments statewide and also arbitration work with AAA. As you recall, the Chief Justice decided that was not a good idea. There was a conflict of interest, which I disagree with, by the way, but nevertheless, I gave up the assigned judging and stayed with arbitration.
And are you still doing that?
Still doing that.
About what percentage of your time would you say you spend doing that?
Oh boy, you know, it's hard to judge, as in civil trials, many of them settle. I probably have emails or phone calls 2 or 3 times a week. Actual trials last year, probably somewhere between 40 and 60 days. So maybe a quarter of the time, third of the time.
And you've been retired now for about 6 years?
Just about.
Can you tell us how you're spending the time that you're not spending doing private judging in this so-called retirement? I'm still growing grapes. I planted a small vineyard on our property. We have 25 acres in Napa in 1990. I farmed that pretty much myself up until a couple years ago when we started traveling quite a bit, and I've had some help since then. And this year I'm actually turning that over to a vineyard manager under a land lease. So but pretty much the last 5, 6 years I've been heavily involved in the vineyard and keeping that going. And do you, what do you do with those grapes that you grow on your place?
We sell them to Silver Oak. I've been on a 10-year contract with them for just about 10 years now. So all the crop goes there. It's a small vineyard. We only have 3 acres and produce about 12 tons of Cabernet, but it's been fun.
And you also, even when you were here on the court, I know had a devoted hobby in your photography. Are you pursuing that?
We've gotten off quite extensively in that in the last several years. I was very fortunate to have been picked up by a publisher in New York did initially a calendar on Napa Valley, and then, in fact, I've done 7 of those now, but that led to a small book on Napa. I did another small book on Sonoma, and just last week published a book on Tuscany. So I've been doing a lot of photography, a lot of publishing.
And you have another book coming up, where you're going to be doing some
We're going to
traveling.
be doing China this year. In the fall, I'm going to be on the Silk Road for about 30 days, taking pictures over there.
When did your interest in photography begin, Les?
Oh boy, I think as a kid, you know, I always loved taking the camera with me wherever I went. But in the 60s and 70s, I did a lot of backpacking in the Sierras, and took the camera with me just to take really landscape stuff for years.
And in addition to your books, I noticed when I was just looking on the internet this morning that there's actually a website that has about 200 of your photographs available as posters in all different sizes and some beautiful images.
Well, thank you.
Shall we give them a plug and tell them where they can find it?
Actually, that came through. I have 2 agencies that have my photographs on their websites. One started out with a small agency here in San Francisco, Ted Straczynski of Photo 2020. He sold to Lonely Planet in Australia, and I've got several hundred images with them. They were the ones that actually sold to All Posters, which has the poster site. And now I've got also an agent in Europe, in Spain, and Age Photostock, who handles my photography over there. So I'm selling images really on the web for all kinds of things, editorial, books, whatever.
Well, and you've certainly seen photography change. When we were talking before we started on the video this morning, you were telling me that up till fairly recently you've been using film and a Hasselblad camera for your photography. Now you've made the shift to digital, right?
It's been a quantum leap, believe me. You know, I had the Hasselblad 2.25 since the mid-'60s, so I've been using that over 40 years now, and everything's gone digital. The stock agencies I'm working with require digital now, and then I had to take the negatives and digitize them. So, yeah, I've gone digital. It's been, I say, a quantum leap here in the last several months.
Do you think you'll get interested in the actual Photoshop working with the images? Now that you've
I
done
have
digital?
so far, to the extent that I'm using Adobe Lightroom to not really manipulate the images, but to what they call development, change the colors, the contrasts, bring up the shadows, things of that type, but without layering, without adding or taking things out of the image. I may get there someday.
And do you enjoy that?
I do enjoy it. It's very time consuming. I enjoy more being out taking pictures.
Did you have any particular heroes in the photography world or mentors?
You know, I guess definitely, yes. Ansel Adams, somebody I've always admired. His son and I were at Stanford together, fraternity brothers, and we used to come into the city after the big game and have cocktails at his home here in San Francisco. This would be back in the mid-'50s, I guess, or early '50s. I've been in his studio a number of times in Carmel before his death, and always admired. In fact, all of my early photography was black and white, and the stuff I did in the Sierras was all black and white. Didn't really switch to color until probably the late '70s.
That's a pretty impressive mentor to have.
Yeah, he was great, wonderful.
And you plan to continue your photography with books
As
to
long
come?
as I can function, you know.
Any other hobbies? I know you were raising alpacas for a while up there in Napa also.
We finally sold the herd after my wife Susan passed away here several years ago. It was just too much. Her mother lives on the property, and it was Susan and Merle's project, really. I was involved in it, but
And Merle is her mother?
her mother.
Yeah.
And so we sold them off probably a year ago.
All right. And I know you have one son from that marriage, Brent.
Brett, he's still at UC Davis. He's on a 10-year program, I think, at this point. So.
And any other children from your earlier marriage?
Have 5 other children, all grown and scattered all over the western United States.
Anything else you'd like to tell the viewing audience on this tape that I may not have covered or we didn't talk about?
Oh boy, that's hard to answer. I think we've pretty much covered a lot of things. I know one of the issues that was raised in the materials that were sent to me was my judicial philosophy. And maybe I could touch on that a bit. I guess I'm conservative in the sense that I really feel that the law structure should be followed and should be applied in cases to resolve legal problems. And I see in our society a drift away from really strict construction of the law and application of the law primarily in the trial courts. That concerns me.
Is there anything that you would like the legal community and the general public to remember about you and your work as a judge, both on the trial court and here?
Oh boy, that's a tough one to answer. I guess I've always prided myself in being thoroughly prepared, spending the time really necessary to arrive at a decision I felt was a valid and good decision. I hope I can be remembered for that. I hope I can be remembered for being fair in far as applying the law and resolving legal issues.
And if you had to do it all over again, would you?
I certainly would, no question about it.
Is there any particular phase of your legal career that was more satisfying than any other?
That's really difficult to answer because they're so different. You know, I thoroughly enjoyed being a trial lawyer, trying lawsuits. It was more difficult than being a judge, I think, in a lot of ways. I enjoyed the trial work as a judge. Very different, of course, than being a trial lawyer in court. And I enjoyed thoroughly being on the bench here. Again, very different than being a trial judge. So I enjoyed each one of them enormously.
I've often felt that it's just a wonderful kind of transition of careers from one career to another, all within the umbrella of the law, but each one has got its own benefits and headaches.
You know, I guess one of the things I've always felt very strongly about is that you really need to lead a balanced life. I've committed myself to the law, but not so totally that I haven't enjoyed a lot of other activities in my life, and travel, photography, vineyards. But I think it's essential for people, and particularly people in the law profession, really to strike that balance, not to be so totally consumed in the law that they have nothing else in their lives. So that's been a struggle and something I've always tried to attain.
Well, that's a wonderful message to give to anyone who may be viewing this tape.
I think it's important. I think it's important today, particularly in the larger law firms in the metropolitan areas where attorneys are required to bill an enormous amount of hours, and their whole life really is their profession. And I think that's a mistake.
Well, we wish you the best in your travels and photography and practice of private judging. Is there anything else you wish to say as we conclude the tape?
That's about it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank you for participating in this interview.